I had just poured myself a cup of strong black coffee and stepped outside to admire the early morning sun when I heard the sound that would change everything, a screeching metallic tear, followed by a voice screaming from my rooftop. I blinked, thinking maybe I was dreaming. But then I saw her. Karen. My roof. Not a contractor. Not someone with authorization. No, it was Karen from the HOA, standing like some sort of suburban warlord with a crowbar in one hand and my solar panel dangling from the other like a prize from a jungle hunt. My brain couldn't even keep up. She shouted, "Today we take back our neighborhood from these eyesores." I dropped my mug, ceramic shattering on concrete, and bolted across the yard yelling, "Karen, what the hell are you doing? Those panels are federally tagged. You're literally committing a felony." Her response, as she pried off another panel, was a smug grin and a laugh. "This is HOA territory now, sunshine." If this story had started any differently, maybe I'd have chalked it up to miscommunication or maybe a bad HOA ruling. But this wasn't that. This was Karen declaring war, on science, on legality, and apparently on sunlight itself. It had started weeks earlier with passive-aggressive comments during HOA meetings when she'd point at my roof and call it a tech monstrosity. But I'd brushed it off because I wasn't just some guy with solar panels. I had clearance. Those panels weren't ordinary store-bought setup. They were federally installed as part of a Department of Energy pilot project I'd been selected for due to my previous work as an energy analyst. They were smart, encrypted, and legally protected. But Karen? Karen didn't care about legalities when it came to her vision of neighborhood uniformity. She cared about matching roofs and beige mailboxes. It began with emails, first from the HOA, then from Karen herself. She claimed my panels violated aesthetic guidelines. I replied with my federal exemption document. She replied with a warning notice about pending fines. Then came the absurdity. A HOA meeting where Karen stood in front of the board, waving an aerial printout of my house and declaring it a visual disruption. I countered with testimony from two neighbors who actually loved the panels and appreciated the backup power during a recent storm outage. Karen ignored them. She declared my panels a threat to the community's image and began rallying support to have them removed. The board wasn't entirely on her side, but Karen didn't seem to care. She didn't wait for vote. She didn't wait for due process. She made it personal. I should have known something was coming. That week, my security cameras picked up her walking past my house 5 separate times, each time pausing to glare at the panels as if she could will them off the roof. The night before the incident, someone had egged my electric meter box. I didn't report it, I figured it was random. But I know now it wasn't. It was a warning. The calm before her unhinged rooftop invasion. So there I stood, helplessly watching Karen rip the next panel off like she was unwrapping an unwanted Christmas gift. I shouted again, "You're destroying government equipment." She looked at me like I had just told her her yoga mat was haunted. "Government, my foot," she scoffed. "These are just overgrown patio lights." I sprinted back inside to grab my phone and call 911, but by the time I returned, Karen's hired muscle, 2 unlicensed guys in paint-stained cargo shorts, were helping her lower the twisted remains of my once precious energy system. I recorded the whole thing, my hands shaking in disbelief. When the police arrived, Karen was still arguing with the workers about how to properly unbolt the inverters. One officer asked, "Ma'am, did you receive any legal approval to do this?" Karen answered like she was reciting a scripture. "The HOA has spoken. We're restoring community order." I rushed forward, thrusting my printed Department of Energy clearance papers into the officer's hands. "You need to stop her. That equipment isn't just mine, it's federal property. There's GPS tracking, encrypted servers. This is serious." The cop gave me a long look, then turned toward Karen with a furrowed brow. That's when Karen made her second mistake. She smirked and said, "I already looked. There were no warning labels." I checked. Except there were. Each panel had micro-etched markings only visible under UV light. I knew this because I helped develop the tech back in DC. Before I moved to this town for peace and quiet, I was part of a team protecting national power infrastructure from cyber threats. And now here I was, watching my former work being desecrated by an entitled neighborhood enforcer who thought HOA bylaws were stronger than federal law. The cops stopped her, finally. One of them, Officer Vega, seemed genuinely concerned when he spotted the charred corner of a battery pack that had shorted due to improper disconnection. "You said this is federally tagged equipment?" he asked me. I nodded. He raised his radio and called for a supervisor. Karen, suddenly less smug, tried to claim it was a misunderstanding. She had only meant to remove one panel, she said. Maybe two. The workers started to back away, realizing this was far above their pay grade. I didn't even have time to be angry. I was exhausted. My entire system was offline, the panels bent and scratched, and the internal diagnostics hub, located in a weather-sealed box on the side of the house, had been knocked loose and left dangling like a broken limb. But as I stood there with my phone still recording and Karen being questioned by two uniformed officers, I realized something. This wasn't over. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. This was a federal matter. Karen had tripped an invisible wire, and the consequences were going to hit harder than she could ever imagine. The officers requested I shut off all remaining battery links and backup systems. I did as asked. They took statements. They confiscated the crowbar and the contractor's tools. Karen was told to leave the property. She muttered something about calling her attorney and stormed off, still acting like she was the victim. But what she didn't know was that by 6 p.m. that evening, a different kind of storm would arrive. Black SUVs from the Department of Energy's Enforcement Division. And Karen's backyard crusade against my solar panels was about to become a case study in how not to mess with the federal government. I backed up the security footage and stored a copy in my encrypted cloud drive. I also emailed it to my contact at the DOE, along with photos of the damage and the names of the so-called contractors Karen had brought in. It felt surreal. Just days ago, I was trimming hedges and reading journals on sustainable grid tech. Now I was building a federal case against a woman who thought her personal taste trumped national energy law. And here's the twist that made everything more satisfying. Those solar panels weren't just ordinary data-gathering unit. They were part of a covert tracking program to detect energy siphoning on national grids. Test units loaded with decoy signatures and dummy infrastructure disguised as regular home systems. Karen hadn't just ripped off my power supply. She had triggered a security breach that would bring in specialists, auditors, and investigators. She thought she was ripping off a homeowner. She didn't know she was dismantling part of a federal intelligence-gathering pilot site. And so, as the sun set behind the cracked skeleton of my energy array, and the blinking blue LEDs of 3 responding cruisers lit up my front yard, I leaned against my mailbox and just watched. Karen's world was about to get a whole lot darker, and not just because she cut off the sunlight. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Karen had clearly underestimated the ripple effect of her rooftop rampage. While she spent the day sulking indoors behind closed curtains, I was out front sweeping up broken ceramic and panel fragments. Neighbors walked by with thinly veiled curiosity, pretending to ask how I was while peeking at the pile of twisted aluminum and scorched wiring stacked like wreckage from a plane crash. One neighbor, Brian, a retired engineer who'd always admired my solar setup, stopped and said, "I heard what happened. My cousin works in utilities. He said you're probably getting federal attention for this." I nodded, too tired to elaborate. In truth, the federal attention had already begun. Around 10 a.m., a matte black SUV rolled slowly through the cul-de-sac. It didn't have license plates, just a tag that read DOEG. A man in a dark polo shirt and aviators stepped out and walked toward my house with the calm, authoritative stride of someone who doesn't need to explain himself. He introduced himself as Special Agent Durant from the Department of Energy's Infrastructure Security Division. He asked to see the damaged panels, the surveillance footage, and any records of prior HOA conflict. I handed him a flash drive and a folder I had prepped the night before. He nodded approvingly, then said something that made my stomach twist and my lips curl in satisfaction. This isn't just vandalism. She tampered with classified equipment. We're escalating. By the time Durant stepped into his vehicle and drove off, I could already sense the shift. I wasn't just some homeowner in a petty neighborhood fight anymore. I was the wrong guy for Karen to mess with. The right kind of wrong. Later that afternoon, 2 more government vehicles pulled in. These ones had official markings and antenna arrays mounted on the roof. They brought out devices that scanned my property, detecting signal loss, data leaks, and EM field corruption. It was like watching a sci-fi film in real time. Meanwhile, Karen peeked out from her front window across the street, her jaw slack as federal agents in tactical boots walked across my lawn like it was a crime scene. She ducked the moment one of them glanced in her direction. But Karen wasn't done. When the official investigation made it clear she had overstepped, she doubled down instead of backing off. That night, someone slid a passive-aggressive flyer under every door in the neighborhood. It had no signature, but it had Karen's tone all over it. It read, "Community reminder. Unauthorized solar structures are subject to HOA scrutiny. Protect our property values." It was printed in bold block letters, with a clip-art son wearing sunglasses that somehow made it worse. I laughed when I read it, more amused than angry. She was panicking, trying to shift the blame. But she didn't realize the stage was no longer hers to control. The real blow came the next morning when the DOE agents returned, this time accompanied by an unmarked van with government laptops and portable antennae. They brought equipment to recover what little data was left in my battery node. Apparently, Karen's amateur hour destruction spree had not only fried the hardware but had interrupted a data relay to a secure server. The server had flagged it as a possible cyber breach, which automatically triggered a compliance escalation. The panel system wasn't just collecting energy data, it was masking grid monitoring software that had been under quiet development for rural resilience projects. In other words, Karen had torn apart the equivalent of a digital canary in the coal mine. And now the federal government wanted heads to roll. Later that day, Durant returned and gave me a rundown of what came next. "We're pursuing multiple charges," he said flatly. "Tampering with federal equipment. Obstruction. Possibly conspiracy if we can prove she hired workers with knowledge of what they were removing." He paused, then added, "We're coordinating with local authorities and your state's energy board. There may be civil suits too. You'll likely be called as a primary witness." I nodded. I had expected retaliation. I hadn't expected Karen to be caught in the jaws of so many overlapping jurisdictions. Karen, meanwhile, decided to take her own PR campaign public. That afternoon, she marched into the HOA clubhouse and called an emergency meeting. Only a few neighbors showed up, but she livestreamed it anyway. Standing in front of the fireplace mantel decorated with fake ivy and motivational plaques, she declared herself a protector of the community. She claimed my panels had caused health problems, sun glare that blinded drivers, and interference with satellite TV. It was absurd. She even called the federal presence a gross overreach of big government, and accused me of being part of a secret tech cabal trying to turn the neighborhood into a surveillance site. What she didn't know was that one of the attending neighbors, Mrs. Castillo, had recorded the whole meeting. She uploaded it to Facebook. Within hours, it started getting shared. At first, it stayed local. Then a regional news page picked it up under the headline, "HOA Vice President Rants About Solar Invasion." I watched the views climb like the numbers on a gas pump. Comments flooded in. Some called her a menace. Others joked about wearing tin-foil hat. A few said what we were all thinking, she had lost it. Things escalated when the HOA president, a nervous man named Reggie, finally spoke up. He called a special board session and posted a notice stating that the HOA had never approved Karen's actions, nor sanctioned any physical removal of property. He emphasized that no bylaws had been passed regarding solar installations and that individual violations were to be handled through proper legal channels. In other words, Reggie threw her under the bus. And Karen? She snapped. The next morning, someone egged Reggie's house. Then someone slashed the tires on my backup generator trailer. A neighbor's Ring camera caught a blurry image of a hooded figure doing both. I sent it straight to Agent Durant. When he saw the footage, he simply said, "This is good. Every action builds our case." But I couldn't help but feel the chill creeping in. Karen was unraveling, and people like that, cornered and desperate, didn't always make rational choices. That evening, I found my front gate tampered with. It wouldn't lock anymore. There were pry marks on the latch. I reinforced it with a temporary bolt, then installed an extra camera. I didn't feel unsafe, exactly, but I felt watched. And I knew Karen wasn't acting alone anymore. She had at least one neighbor helping her. Probably one of the three who had always mumbled about tech being the end of suburbia. It wasn't just HOA war anymore. It was a full-blown ideological crusade. And I had been cast as the villain in Karen's beige-colored dystopia. Still, I had something she didn't: facts, documentation, and a growing wave of support. As the federal investigation progressed, more neighbors came to me quietly. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others asked if I needed help rebuilding the panels. A group of high school students even offered to volunteer. One of them wanted to study renewable energy, and saw the whole ordeal as a lesson in civic failure. I welcomed the help. Karen, on the other hand, began spiraling further. She started putting up signs in her yard that read, "Protect our skies," and "Say no to solar tyranny." Her lawn decorations became a bizarre protest zone, complete with a scarecrow holding a toy sun. By now, most of the neighborhood was just embarrassed. But embarrassment couldn't undo what she had done. And neither could denial. The Department of Energy wasn't letting this one go. And neither was I. Because this wasn't just about panels anymore. This was about boundaries. About science. About the idea that some people think their rules matter more than the law. Karen had crossed a line. And now, the sun was rising on a very different chapter, for both of us. It didn't take long for Karen to realize that her entire foundation was crumbling beneath her carefully manicured lawn. By the third day after the incident, her smug walks around the cul-de-sac had stopped completely. The wind chimes she loved so much were silent, and even her little white lapdog wasn't being paraded around the block anymore. For a woman who once thrived on visibility and control, her sudden vanishing act said everything. But while she was retreating, I was getting busier. Calls from investigators, energy board reps, and even 2 journalists started coming in. One reporter from a renewable energy watchdog group asked for a statement. I gave him a calm, professional quote, but inside I was still burning with disbelief. I had seen HOA pettiness before, parking fines, mailbox color arguments, but nothing like this. Then came the shocker. Karen filed a counterclaim. I got the letter from her attorney, or rather, from a guy named Craig who ran a half-abandoned law office next to a vape shop and advertised legal services with "No appointment necessary" signs in the window. Karen's claim accused me of installing weaponized surveillance panels and suggested I had violated her privacy, endangered air traffic, and inflicted mental anguish upon her through solar-induced stress exposure. I had to read the document twice. It was both outrageous and laughable. Still, I forwarded it to my DOE contact. Durant responded within an hour with a dry, perfect line. Let her keep digging. Meanwhile, the real work continued. The Department of Energy team began setting up a temporary diagnostic station in my garage. They brought a new stack of gear to assess what data could be salvaged from the fried systems. It turned out that Karen had done more than physical damage. Her interference had triggered a failed data dump during a grid simulation test, which alerted the Cyber Incident Division. Now, she wasn't just facing destruction of government property. She was tied to a breach report that had been automatically escalated to Homeland Security channels due to the nature of the encrypted signal test. She didn't know it, but she had walked straight into a digital landmine. To make things worse for herself, Karen refused to back off in public. When she wasn't hiding indoors, she was on her porch posting handwritten signs accusing the government of harassment. One of them had a picture of a sun with devil horns. Another said, "Big energy lies." She even went so far as to print flyers claiming I was secretly mining cryptocurrency with sky lasers, and that the neighborhood had a right to reclaim the airspace over my home. It was like watching a conspiracy theorist slowly unravel in real time. Most neighbors ignored her. A few quietly took pictures and sent them to me. One kind soul, old Mrs. Castillo, left cookies on my doorstep with a note that said, "Keep fighting the good fight. She's gone totally bananas." But what none of us expected was Karen's next move. One evening, as I was sorting through digital logs with Agent Durant in my living room, my backup battery system tripped. All the power in the house flickered. The diagnostics computer rebooted. Durant and I exchanged a look. We ran outside. That's when we saw it. The wires to my exterior battery bank had been cut. Not with precision, not cleanly. It looked like someone had taken garden shears and hacked through them in the dark. The insulation was shredded, one battery casing dented. Durant knelt down and examined the damage. This wasn't some random act. This was sabotage. Again. I knew it wasn't just vandalism. Karen was escalating. She couldn't win through the HOA, so now she was trying to scare me into removing the rest of the system. Durant called in the local police again and ordered a forensic team to collect samples. When the officers arrived, they scanned the fence, the ground, the wire, and even a footprint left in soft mud by the side gate. That footprint turned out to be the biggest mistake she'd made yet. The sole pattern matched a very specific pair of orthopedic sandals Karen had been photographed wearing in her anti-solar rant video. The evidence was circumstantial, but together with the footage, the flyers, the previous sabotage, and now 2 direct property damage incidents, the case was no longer just about damage. It was about intent. The next day, Durant confirmed that the DOE was officially pressing charges. He handed me the preliminary federal filing document. Karen's name was listed under 5 violations, including destruction of federally owned research technology, obstruction of an energy compliance operation, and unlawful interference with digital infrastructure. But as satisfying as it was to see justice take shape, I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. Sure enough, that evening, I heard shouting from across the street. Karen was on her porch, phone in hand, yelling at someone on speaker. She said, "I'm not going to jail over solar panels. This is a political witch hunt. I don't even understand what encryption means." Neighbors were beginning to gather in driveways. People were whispering, recording. Karen was unraveling in public. It was surreal. She was a woman who had once lectured me on the color of my mailbox numbers, and now she was screaming about deep-state solar espionage. The best part? Her meltdown ended with a dramatic "I'll show them," as she stomped back inside. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. By the end of the week, the local news finally caught wind. A segment aired under the banner, "HOA Drama Turns Federal, Solar Panel Sabotage Sparks Criminal Charges." The clip showed overhead drone footage of my house, a few grainy screenshots of Karen's anti-solar signs, and a blurred-out image of the moment she was allegedly on my roof with the crowbar. It wasn't long before the clip made its way to a national Reddit thread under r/entitled people. The top comment read, "When Karen picks the one neighbor protected by the Department of Energy." The next comment, "This is why you don't mess with science nerds who have government friends." I'll admit, I laughed harder than I had in days. The next few days passed in a strange sort of calm. Karen remained locked in her house. Her signs started to disappear, one by one. Either she had finally realized how deep the hole was, or someone from the HOA had demanded she take them down before they got dragged into the mess as co-conspirators. I didn't care. I focused on rebuilding. With help from the DOE and a few volunteers, we began restoring a limited version of the panel array. They even brought in a newer prototype to install as a gesture of good faith. Durant told me this one had better shielding, better encryption, and the latest firmware for remote diagnostic. Karen had destroyed something valuable, but now it was being rebuilt, stronger, brighter, smarter. Still, I didn't drop my guard. I installed motion sensor lights, a second set of cameras, and reinforced my fence. I wasn't afraid of Karen physically, but I had learned that entitled people with delusions of authority can be the most dangerous kind. They don't stop when proven wrong, they double down. And even as her world closed in, I knew Karen would try something again. She couldn't help herself. People like her never could. That night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I looked out at the street. It was quiet, peaceful. But I knew peace in this neighborhood was never permanent. Karen had started a fire that couldn't be put out with apologies or HOA mediation. And as her porch light flickered behind tightly drawn curtains, I could almost hear her plotting. She still believed this was her community. But what she didn't understand, what she never understood, was that there are some fights you can't win with arrogance and entitlement. Especially not when you're fighting someone backed by the power of the federal government and the light of the sun itself. By the time the federal charges were officially filed, the neighborhood had completely turned. Karen, who once roamed the sidewalks like a self-appointed queen, was now a ghost in her own domain. Her porch lights stayed off at night, her shades were drawn all day, and not a single HOA meeting had been called since the incident with the backup battery wire cutting. Her little empire of rules and passive-aggressive control had collapsed faster than any of us expected. Even the board members who had once backed her ideas from a distance were now scrambling to distance themselves. The HOA president, Reggie, issued a formal statement that made local headlines. The Homeowners Association condemns any unlawful or unauthorized actions by any member, regardless of title or position. We support the investigation fully. It was the HOA equivalent of throwing someone under a bus, then reversing over them twice for good measure. Meanwhile, my life had transformed into a strange hybrid of media attention, legal preparation, and neighborhood spectacle. A new crew from the Department of Energy arrived to install upgraded monitoring gear. This time, with clearly marked federal seals and warning labels in bold font, visible from the curb. One agent joked, "We figured you'd want them large enough even Karen can't claim she didn't see them." We both laughed, but beneath the humor was a shared understanding that things were far from over. Karen hadn't just broken panels or cut wires. She had disrupted an entire data experiment linked to infrastructure resilience. Her actions, once thought petty, had risen to the level of federal policy concern. But that didn't stop her from making one last desperate move. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, just as I was heading to the garage to meet with two technicians restoring data from the old system, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up in front of my house. I stepped out under the awning, heart sinking slightly. For a second, I wondered if some bizarre technicality had flipped the situation. But when the deputy stepped out, he looked more annoyed than official. He handed me a paper and said, "I'm required to serve this, but I'd file it under creative fiction." I took the envelope and opened it to find that Karen had filed a formal restraining order against me. Her claim? That my solar panels had been installed with intent to monitor her home, and that I had personally threatened her with federal intimidation. The paper was riddled with legal jargon, almost none of it applicable, but what stood out most was the attached hand-drawn diagram of my house with little arrows pointing to her windows labeled, "Possible laser rays." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The deputy rolled his eyes and muttered, "She's been calling 3 times a day. We're just trying to keep her from spinning out completely." I signed the receipt form and told him I understood. He gave me a sympathetic nod and walked off into the drizzle. That night, I forwarded the paperwork to Agent Durant, who replied within minutes. His message was short and direct. This actually helps our case. Shows her state of mind. We're bringing it into evidence. Still, I felt the weight of it. Karen had no power left, no legal standing, no support from the HOA, but her paranoia was metastasizing. The thought of her spiraling into deeper delusion while still living across the street made my skin crawl. I started locking everything twice. Not out of fear, just out of realism. People cornered by truth and consequence don't always behave predictably. The next day brought an unexpected twist. Durant called me personally and asked if I'd be willing to attend a closed-door court hearing with Karen present. The federal judge assigned to the case had requested a preliminary hearing before moving to trial, and they wanted both parties present to provide brief statements and confirm the evidence record. I agreed, curious to see what Karen would say under oath. When I arrived at the courthouse, a modest federal facility 2 towns over, I found Durant already waiting, flanked by a federal prosecutor and another agent in a suit. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, wearing oversized sunglasses and a trench coat despite the indoor setting. Her lawyer, if you could call him that, was the same Craig guy with the vape shop office. He looked like he had just learned what a courtroom was. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, quickly established control. She asked Karen if she understood the charges. Karen tried to launch into a speech about neighborhood oppression and energy monopolies, but the judge cut her off. This isn't a town hall. This is federal court. You will speak when asked. Durant presented the timeline. The permit, the federal contract, the surveillance footage, the wire sabotage, the forensic report matching Karen's shoe print, and the public video of her making inflammatory and false claims. Then he dropped the final bombshell. The Department of Energy had completed its system audit and determined that during the time of sabotage, Karen's actions had corrupted a live simulation running on encrypted channels. That simulation was tied into a test for grid vulnerabilities in emergency scenarios, meaning her tampering had essentially falsified data in a national security simulation. The judge's face darkened. Karen's lawyer tried to object, saying she hadn't known. The judge responded coldly, that may be true, but ignorance does not erase consequences. Especially when warnings were posted. Then she turned to me. Mr. Ayers, you have a final statement before I move this forward to full proceedings? I stood up. I spoke calmly. I told her that I wasn't seeking revenge. I wanted protection. I wanted accountability. And I wanted to ensure that no other homeowner, no other researcher, no one under a federal contract had to go through what I did just because someone didn't like the color of a roof or the look of progress. Karen said nothing after that. She sat there, lips pressed together, tapping her fingers nervously on the table. Her lawyer whispered to her, but she didn't look at him. The judge confirmed that the case would proceed, but under expedited federal priority. The charges would stand. The protective order she filed would be dismissed for lack of evidence and intent, and she would be restricted from approaching my property or contacting me in any way going forward. When I stepped out into the hallway, I felt something shift. It wasn't victory. It wasn't celebration. It was a quiet, heavy sort of closure. The kind you feel when something toxic finally loses its grip on your life, not because you won, but because the truth finally caught up to the lie. Back home, things returned to a kind of new normal. The rebuilt solar system was running better than ever. With federal clearance now visible and stamped on every component, I had the rare privilege of being the only homeowner in the area with a federally certified smart grid node. Neighbors stopped by more often, not just to ask questions, but to talk. The fear Karen had instilled was gone. Some of them even brought over sketches for their own solar layouts, inspired by the mess but eager to innovate. I gave advice where I could. Shared what I knew. Progress wasn't something to be feared. it just needed light to grow. Karen, for her part, became a cautionary tale. Word spread fast, especially after her HOA privileges were suspended indefinitely. Her name became shorthand for overreach. Her house, once the pinnacle of strict landscaping and rulebooks, grew wild with weeds and silence. No one visited. Her porch gathered dust. Even her dog, once yapping like a tiny alarm system, stopped barking. She had become a monument to what happens when control turns to obsession. Of this bizarre, exhausting saga came not with a bang but with an invitation. It arrived by certified mail and bore the seal of the Department of Energy. Inside was a formal letter signed by the Undersecretary of Infrastructure. My property had been selected to host the next phase of Soul Track development, the very project Karen had unintentionally helped to publicize through her own recklessness. The irony was so rich I had to read the letter twice. They weren't just replacing what she destroyed, they were expanding it. My house would now serve as a demonstration hub for a public-private initiative focused on grid resilience, sustainable energy, and neighborhood integration. In short, I was being asked to become a face of the very thing Karen had tried to erase. Preparations began almost immediately. A truck arrived with new panels. Sleeker, smarter, built with solar skin technology that blended with roofing material while generating more output than traditional panels. A separate vehicle brought a battery wall unit the size of a vending machine that would sit discreetly behind my garage. Another brought a digital signage display designed to show real-time energy data to visitors. The DOE team installed new ground sensors, upgraded the satellite link, and connected everything into a newly developed smart interface. They even offered to host a public demonstration. I agreed, but only if the community was invited. They smiled and told me that was exactly the point. Word spread quickly. A week later, flyers were posted. This time, not by Karen, but by the local utility board and DOE partners. Solar Resilience Day was scheduled for Saturday. There would be a walkthrough, free solar assessments, even a local food truck or two. I braced myself for pushback from Karen, but it never came. Her house remained silent. Curtains closed. Yard untended. Whether by shame, fear, or legal instruction, she was nowhere to be seen. Her absence was louder than any of her past arguments. On the morning of the event, I woke up to sunshine as usual, but it felt different. I stood outside in a clean shirt, coffee in hand, and watched people slowly arrive. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. Families with kids. 2 city officials. A pair of reporters with badges from a green tech outlet. One of the DOE agents, Martinez, greeted everyone with a clipboard and enthusiasm. By noon, over 40 people were gathered on my lawn. The sign glowed beside them, showing power collected, energy distributed, and kilowatt savings in real time. People pointed, asked questions, took notes, and smiled. For the first time in months, the energy on this street felt like progress instead of conflict. Then came the twist no one expected. A woman approached from across the street. She was dressed plainly, in jeans and a cardigan, her once voluminous hair now pulled into a simple ponytail. It was Karen. She walked slowly, as if unsure whether to cross the invisible line between old authority and new humility. People noticed. Conversations dipped. I turned toward her, unsure of what to expect. She stopped at the edge of my driveway and looked around. Then, to everyone's shock, including mine, she quietly said, "I just came to see what all the damage was really for." There was a pause. Heavy, awkward. No one clapped. No one shouted. But something in her tone felt different. She wasn't there to fight. Maybe not to apologize, but at least to face it. I didn't say anything at first. I simply nodded and gestured to the display screen. "This," I said. "It's for this. Cleaner power. Safer systems. The kind of future where your AC doesn't shut off during blackouts." She looked at the screen, hands in her pockets. After a few seconds, she said softly, "I didn't know. I thought it was just you trying to be flashy." I didn't argue. What was the point? Everything that needed to be said had already been proven. She stayed for a few minutes, didn't interact much, and then walked away just as quietly. She didn't come back. But somehow, that moment closed a loop. She saw it. With her own eyes. The thing she'd tried so hard to destroy was now the centerpiece of something bigger. Something she would never be part of. As the event continued, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. People asked for DOE contact info. A few signed up for subsidized solar programs. The city rep told me they were considering adding our block to a pilot neighborhood for community-wide energy sharing. The event wasn't just symbolic. It created ripples that would go beyond my street, maybe even beyond the city. What Karen had intended to erase had become the seed of transformation. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the equipment was being packed up, Agent Durant pulled me aside. He handed me a flash drive and said, "This has the final case documentation. We're closing it officially next week." The judge signed off on the plea deal. She's being fined, barred from HOA leadership, and assigned mandatory community service under environmental stewardship. I raised an eyebrow at that. What kind of service? Durant smirked. Guiding tours at a solar education center. I couldn't help but laugh. You're kidding. He shook his head. Nope. Her badge will literally say, "Ask me about solar panels." It was, without question, the most ironic punishment they could have given her. As night fell, I stood under the soft glow of my porch light, watching the panels gently rotate on their tracking axis, following the last of the sunlight. The hum of energy was comforting now, not just for its function but for what it represented. Resilience. Not just of power systems but of people, of ideas, of the belief that progress doesn't need permission from fear or ignorance. It only needs time, and the persistence to stand tall even when someone tries to tear it down with a crowbar. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to shift again. People painted their fences, planted flowers. A few even asked about solar rebate. I helped when I could. Shared knowledge. Built trust back where Karen had poisoned it. The HOA quietly replaced her on the board with a younger, more forward-thinking resident. The first thing they did? Rewrite the bylaws to clarify the acceptance of federally protected infrastructure. That amendment passed with unanimous approval. Karen's house remained quiet. She came and went rarely. No signs. No more rants. Occasionally I saw her tending her roses, but she never looked up. And that was fine. She didn't have to. Because I didn't build all this for her. I built it for the future. For the next homeowner who wants to innovate without fear. For the next neighborhood that decides maybe, just maybe, they don't need to be afraid of the sun. One afternoon, I got a letter from a high school student who'd attended the Solar Resilience Day. She wrote about how inspired she was by the story, and how she wanted to study renewable energy now. She thanked me for not giving up. I pinned that letter to the corkboard in my garage, right above the diagram of my first panel layout. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Not revenge. Not even justice. Just the idea that light, when nurtured, grows. And while Karen might never say sorry, or fully understand what she tried to stop, the world around her had changed anyway. The panels stayed. The lights stayed on. And the future moved forward, silently, steadily, and powered by something she could never control.